Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 12th and final lecture in this series on medieval Armenian poetry. I've enjoyed so much getting to prepare and share this series with you, and I want to thank everyone for your attendance and engagement, the good questions that you asked, the response and feedback. And I especially want to thank those who've made it a point to be present from week to week and just help establish a sense of continuity. And it's meant a lot to me to have kind of constant presence and engagement from people and feel like we're on a journey together, which is what this has been for me. And with the lecture tonight, Sayat Nova and the Ashugh tradition, in a way, we come full circle. Because if you remember at the beginning of the series, we talked about this kind of split or bifurcation that came about when, after the invention of the alphabet and Armenian started to become a written language, it was largely in the purview of the church clerical figures who wrote largely in prose and modeled their works off of Greek and Syriac theological texts and the like. And we talked about how there was a whole separate, almost like a parallel universe, which was the Armenian oral literary tradition, which was largely composed of poetry, poetic texts, which predated Christianity, and both contained songs and traditions about the ancient pre-Christian Armenian mythological and religious traditions, as well as songs for entertainment, wedding, dances, as well as funeral laments and the like. And then we saw, fast forwarding, after poetry started to enter in the form of the Siragans and other songs that were composed by earlier writers, and then especially Gregory of Nodeg. Then we saw how Nersess Spring very self-consciously chose to use poetic forms that were more popular in the non-Christian sphere, but to infuse them with Christian content, theological, spiritual content, and material as a way of capturing the attention and hearts and minds of the people for with Christian material, but in a form that's more palatable and accessible. And one of his innovations, in addition to borrowing poetic forms and being such a master of poetry himself, was also to start using in literary form of the language closer to the vernacular, which we call Middle Armenian, Michin Hayeden. And this became very popular after him. And so in the second half of the series, we saw a number of important figures like Hovannes Yerzengatsi, Mogerdich Nagash, Nahabed Kuchak and Haydens, and other figures who composed in this form of the language that was closer to the written form, and as we saw, was full of borrowings from Persian, Turkish, Arabic, because it was based on how people actually spoke, not a refined literary language. Most of those writers we looked at, if you remember, were in the more Western part of where Armenians lived, and we saw forms of the language that kind of anticipated modern Western Armenian as it would come to be standardized. Well, now with the Ashugh tradition, which is, we can think of the word Ashugh as being like minstrel or bard. This tradition is mostly associated with the center of Tiflis, and largely most of the writers or singers who composed as Ashughs were in the more eastern sphere. And so the dialect of Sayat Nova is basically, we could say, like Georgian Armenian or Tiflis Armenian dialect. And it's somewhat different than writers like, it's actually very different for me, especially reading it from writers like Hovhannes Yerzhengatsi, Mogerdich Nagash, etc. Also with the Ashughs, we can see how I mentioned it's like coming full circle, because they actually operated in a courtly setting mostly, and composed for feasts, marriages, other kind of pleasure, entertainment scenarios, which was just the kind of thing that the Christian writers, of the early period always railed against and talked about the gusans, who would perform kind of like pagan music or non-religious music, non-Christian music at weddings and these kind of feasts and occasions. Well, by this time with the Ashughs, we're operating in a Christianized royal context, as we'll see mostly with the Georgian Bagrationi court, a branch of the Bagratid royal family that survived and remained prominent in Georgia after they ceased to function. The branch of the family ceased to function in the Armenian realm. And many of the Ashughs, such as Sayat Novas, we'll see performed in their courts and were patronized by their rulers. But by this time, both the rulers and the Ashughs are, self-identify as Christians and are performing these songs with content that clearly reflects a Christian worldview, even if it is also meant to celebrate very universally human emotions and feelings like love and passion and pleasure and wine and topics such as these. So, what is an ashugh? Well, this is a word that means minstrel or bard. That's how it's used. That's what it refers to. But it's actually from an Arabic word, ashigh, which means it's the participle form of the word that means a lover. A lover. So the Armenian of this would be like Siragan, which is actually my middle name, or Sirogh, like a lover, one who loves. That tips you off to the kind of genre or content or themes, we could say, that fills the texts or lyrics even of these poetic songwriters, the Ashughs, which are the most common theme is love, the physical love between one human being to another. And because it's often in the courtly setting, it's often about unrequited love of, a male lover for the female beloved, who he can never, seem to attain, or is trying to get to, reply to his advances. This manuscript image is wonderful because it actually shows some of the instruments that were typically played in these settings. You can see the kanun, you can see flute, duduk-like instrument. There's many varieties of these instruments. As we just noticed, if anyone went to the Mogerdich Nagash concert in New York, the person playing the wind instrument had like 5 different kinds of flutes, like duduk and various varieties. There's also string instruments, which are the most important, we'll talk about later, and you can see multiple of them here. This Ashugh was not particular to Armenians, but was a common figure in a kind of larger Turkish, Persian cultural world that Armenians shared and participated in and created in. So Ashik or Ashik is the Turkish form that's also used in Persian, and really Turkish was the kind of primary language that most Ashughs performed and composed in. That was kind of like with, we could say like pop music today, English is like the standard because the Beatles sort of started it out and everyone looks to that as the typical or the norm. And even sometimes, French pop singers or Italian pop singers will choose to write in English, although in other songs, they'll also use French or Italian. Well, it was kind of like this in this period. Most everyone did Turkish, but people would also use other languages too, like Sayat Nova and Nalash Hobnatan, who was a predecessor of Sayat Novas in this tradition, also composed in Armenian. This reference, this colophon that we talked about with Nahabad Kuchak last time, was actually, I think, as far as we know, the first usage of the word Ashugh in Armenian text. I would have to double check on that, but I think that is correct. And so remember, there was this manuscript from the early 17th century that referenced Ashugh Kuchak. So one who composed and performed songs in this. And later scholars who were, remember we talked about the whole identity of Nahabad Kuchak and how really these texts were written by a variety of figures and not just him. Well, the texts that have been solidly identified as belonging to Ashugh Kuchak are 12 to 14 poems or so that are all in Turkish. And that sort of indicates to you, or is a good representation of how Turkish was kind of the main or the primary language for this genre of performance. So Sayat Nova was no exception to this. In fact, he was a very typical, in some ways, representative of this overall tradition, although he also brought his unique elements to it. And it's not an accident that he's the most famous from an Armenian perspective of these performers because of how talented and impressive his poems and songs are in 3 different languages. So as you can see on the screen, he composed in the Azeri form of Turkish, Armenian, and Georgian. And you can see how the majority that he composed were in Turkish. About half of that amount was in Armenian, and then about half of that in Georgian. And the Armenian that he used was his Tiflis dialect of Armenian. Just like these other writers we've seen, Hovanesir, Zangatsi, etc., who wrote in their dialect. There's 2 main secondary sources that I've used in preparing this and that I would really recommend, both for doing a really great job of discussing all the previous scholarship that came before them and presenting Sayat Nova in a much larger context that takes account of all the languages he composed in and other exemplary Ashughs of the time and of different language traditions. One is by Charles Dowsett, who was the former professor of Armenian at Oxford University. Sayat Nova, an 18th century troubadour. Very long book, and he writes in a very, it's both like a sophisticated but also pleasurable Oxford sort of style, kind of giving his judgments on everything he encounters and writing in a pleasant and interesting way. The other was by he was a PhD student at UCLA ahead of me, Shi Yang, who is Chinese by background and came to UCLA just to do his PhD. And he wrote a fantastic dissertation, Sayat Nova, within the Near Eastern Bardic tradition. And again, taking well account of the Turkish and Georgian and other figures who composed in this tradition, and doing a great job of reviewing all the scholarship that came before him and setting Sayat Nova in a larger context. Both of these can be found online, digitized. Sayat Nova also wrote he would mix languages, and it's clear from his writings how he delighted in the use of different languages. So he has some poems or songs that really emphasize that, where one line is Turkish, the next line's Armenian, or things like that. So he basically lived throughout the 18th century. And we see this play with different languages, perhaps even in his own name. So from one of the Georgian poems, he says, and sorry about my Georgian pronunciation because I don't know Georgian, but Sayat Nova Makvian Arutinavad, which means they call me Sayat Nova, I am Arutin. And from this and other indications, we know that his baptismal or his given name was Arutin, which is a shortened form of Harutun, resurrection, or we have like the Greek name Anastasius. Whereas he took a performing name, or his Ashugh name was Sayat Nova. And there's been a lot of discussion of what does Sayat Nova mean? And from all the discussion or theories out there, it seems the most likely is that Sayat is from Arabic Sayyid, which means master, lord, mister. And then Nova could be either the Persian Nava, which is voice, sound, or song, or even Russian. Russian was just starting to have an influence in the Caucasus at the time, the word for new. And so either his name could be Master of Song, if you take like the Arabic Persian combination, which is probably the most likely, or something like Mr. New, or something like that, where it's more the sense of new. Or maybe he even intentionally had ambiguity and would have delighted in both meanings. It was so interesting reading about Sayat Nova's life because, he's so famous. He's kind of become a cultural icon. We all kind of think we know about him, or at least something about him. At least I did. But when I started to really read these books and delve deeper into it, I realized, wow, there's so much I didn't know about him, and such an interesting life story. So some of you may not know that after his career as a minstrel and a courtly singer, he was potentially, it's not clear, potentially expelled from the Georgian court or banished. And then he became a monk associated with Haghpat Monastery in the northern part of Armenia today. And he took, or maybe not a monk, but he was a priest. He was ordained a priest. And the reason I said monk was he copied manuscripts. And we have some of those manuscripts that he copied. So he was ordained a priest in 1760. And after that, copied manuscripts at Haghpat Monastery. And his priestly name he was given was Stepanos, Der Stepanos. So he copies it under Der Stepanos. And in some colophons, as we'll see, he'll say Der Stepanos vor Sayat Nova Asin, like who they call Sayat Nova, or used to call Sayat Nova. There are two main sources for his songs. So this was something really interesting to me as I started looking into this, was like, how do we even have all of his texts? Well, it was somewhat standard practice for these ashughs to keep a daftar. and record all of their writings in what was called a daftar, which is Persian basically for notebook or diary journal kind of thing, notebook, like Armenian dedrag. And so we have Sayat Nova's own handwritten dedrag or daftar. And this is very interesting. So it was written in 1765 by Sayat Nova, just a few years after he retired. And listen to this. In the dedrag, all the Armenian poems, with the exception of a couple, the mixed language poems, he actually wrote in Georgian script. So he used the Georgian script, which you see on the screen, even to write the Armenian texts. Obviously, the Georgian texts were written in Georgian script. And then for the Azeri poems, he wrote using either Armenian script or Georgian script. So Turkish at the time would have been written with, a modified form of the Arabic script, but he probably maybe didn't know that script or certainly wasn't educated or trained in it. So he used mostly the Armenian script and also the Georgian script to write the Turkish. Like we have a lot of Turkish material from this time and later written in Armenian letters. And then it's interesting, he was clearly trained in Armenian. He knew some classical Armenian. He later copied manuscripts in classical Armenian. But when it came to writing his own Georgian Armenian dialect, which all his poems are written in, he seems to have felt more comfortable writing those in the Georgian script. The second major source is a manuscript copied by his younger son, he had two, Ioane Hovannes, in 1823. And the whole manuscript is entirely in the Georgian script. Both the Armenian poems, songs, and the Georgian ones. And I'm not sure if his son included the Turkish ones also. But it really shows you just how strong the overall Georgian cultural element was at this period. So Armenians at this time, like Sayat Nova, lived under Georgian Christian rulers who, like I mentioned, were descendants of a branch of the Bagratid family. And they were the Bagrationi in Georgian family tree. And so very, very close cultural connections with Armenians. And Sayat Nova surely clearly knew Georgian and conversed comfortably in that and composed in Georgian, as well as Armenian and Turkish. He seems to have been educated at Sanahin Monastery. And Sanahin and Hakhpat, the one Sanahin he was probably educated at, Hakhpat he basically retired to. There are two monasteries right next to each other in today's Lori province of Armenia. And they were both built in the 10th century by Bagratid Armenian patrons. And they were very important monasteries in that area, which at this time were under larger Georgian rule, but filled with Armenians. Most of the pictures here are from, I'm sure most of you recognize the film Naran Kuina, Sergei Parajanov's The Cover of Pomegranates, which is it's an absolute masterpiece. It's one of my very favorite films. And Parajanov in the film sets out to represent not Sayat Nova's life story in a sort of biographical, linear way, but as he says in the outset of the film, this film will represent in a symbolic way the inner world and experience of the poet, singer, Sayat Nova, or something like that. So it's a symbolic, representative film representation of Sayat Nova's inner life and his creative work. And it's a gorgeous film. We'll watch a clip at the end, and then hopefully everyone that hasn't seen it will go out and watch it. And so there's a beautiful opening that we'll see that is about his early life imagined, being educated at Sanahin Monastery. So as far as the instruments go, there were three main instruments that he used, and we actually have a note by him at the end of one of his poems in his Dedrag, in his notebook, where he wrote the following. Es divani chislavne. So this is one of the best of my poems in the collection, basically. And this, I think, was originally written in Georgian script, and I, from the transliteration, put it into Armenian because the Georgian characters are unknown to me. But you can hear a little bit of his dialect here. So, ov or sovri ogor miase, himi guzim te hayavarasim, amen astvads, is, Mıradasu vorti arutines, bastutsin chori yarsun darin, kaluchtiri amenan charin, ama surp garabidi garogutanov, sovretsa kamanchen, uchongurn utamburen. And so you can see he says, basically, this poem is one of the best among the divan. Whoever learns it, let him say, Lord have mercy. Now I want to say something in Armenian. Amen, oh God. And he says, I, Arutin, son of a pilgrim, Mahdesi, one who's made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, essentially. Son of a pilgrim, from the time I was little until the age of 30, gave myself over to all manner of amusement or song. So he calls his songs chager. So he could be referring to his songs or just amusement in general. But by the power of the holy precursor, meaning St. John the Baptist, who was the patron saint of Ashugh, I learned the kamancha, the chongur, and the tambur. And these are the instruments that you can see on the screen. And so these were the string instruments. They were kind of forms of sort of like forms of a violin, meaning they're played with whatever that is called. And so the one on the far left is the kamancha. In the middle of this picture is the chongur. And then this one being played here is the tambur or tar, it's also called. So these are the main instruments he used. And we know from his own words. In terms of the performance context, as I mentioned, he was patronized by a Georgian ruler who was named Irakli II. So this is the Georgian form of Heraclius or Hercules. There was a Roman Byzantine emperor, Heraclius, in the 7th century that he was likely named after. So Sayat Nova performed in the Georgian court between 1742 and 1759 about. And it was this Georgian Bagrationi monarch who at first was king of Kakheti and then king of Kakheti and Kartli. And these are basically parts of Georgia. Like, how in the Armenian context we had the Bagratuni and Artsuni or the Sunik, it's basically like that. So here's a picture so we have an idea. Here's Lake Van down here, Lake Savan. Here's Hakhpat and Sanahin, where he was active, the monasteries, educated and then retired to. And here's the court or capital Tel Aviv, which is the capital of Kakheti, which is this region of Georgia. And then this is Kartli, another region of Georgia, which at this initially were divided or separate kingdoms, and then Irakli united them into one united kingdom at the end of Sayat Nova's minstrel career. But Sayat Nova actually was in Tel Aviv, in this court, where he performed, not Tiflis. I'd always thought it was Tiflis before I started looking into this. And he performed in what was called the majlis. And this is basically the word for like an assembly. So it's, if you've ever been to like a museum or well, obviously a lot of people have been in the Middle East and seen real ones, but I've only seen them in museums. Kind of a big, large open room, beautifully decorated with seating around the sides of the room so that the middle of the room is open, and that's where dancing and songs and performances would happen. So this is basically the court entertainment room, essentially. I think you could also eat there too. Just to show you, well, here's a couple quotes here, again, from his Georgian poems. Sayat Novas Chelmetzip e Ken Shahbazi Iraklia. Sayat Nova's sovereign is Irakli, the royal falcon prince. So this is this Georgian monarch. Or Sakart Velos Mepi Sazandarivar. I am the minstrel of the king of Georgia. One of the very interesting things I learned was that, there's all kinds of figures, of course, associated with the court. And there's all kinds of ranks and who's in charge of who and ways to organize all these different figures. Well, the singers and dancers reported to the chief cook. The head of the kitchen was in charge of the singers and dancers. And what that really shows you is how their performance was linked to being entertainment at the feast. So very similar actually to even how many, contemporary Armenian events will happen where like oud or kef music, you have the kef music and it's often done during a meal with people eating, or even a comedy show. Have a comedy show and there will be, you'll buy your ticket that comes with your table and food and drinks. This was like a new concept to me as someone who didn't really grow up in an Armenian cultural environment and was used to the way Americans do concerts and things like that, where food and those don't necessarily mix. It's like you go to a comedy show, you just are watching the comedy. You can get drinks before or after. Maybe sometimes you can have a drink during the comedy, but not like a whole meal usually. Or same with a concert, like only at like a music festival where it's a whole day thing would you have eating and it together, but usually you just are at the concert watching or the performance. But in the Middle East, you like to have the two together and it would go on a long time. One of the interesting notes here, which especially for our purposes about looking at the, we've talked about kind of the conflict that arose often between ecclesiastical writers and poets, was this note from a contemporary observer of the Georgian courts who traveled around and wrote about what he saw. One thing he noted, among many other things, was that when the Catholicos and bishops were present, there was no instrumental music, only chants. And then when they had departed, the music, dancing, and diversions began. And so you can even see that kind of split still here in this period where this kind of music is associated with physical, sensual, sensory pleasures. And it's viewed as not appropriate for the representatives of the spiritual realm, the moral, spiritual representatives. So while they're there, you have just chanting, voice chanting. And then once they leave, bring out the singers, bring out the dancers, and it's like the party kind of time. So that was the context in which Sayat Nova performed. And I mentioned there was some possible scandal involved. A lot of it is conjecture. He writes a lot about a figure in his poems, the beloved that he's devoted to. And I should have put this on here. I think it was, she's been identified as a relation of the king Heraclius, Anna, I think was her name, and I think she might have been his sister. And eventually something happened, there was some falling out, and he seems to have been banished or exiled from the court. And after that was when he retired to Haghpat Monastery, which is pictured here. On the right is the bell tower. Some of you, I'm sure, have been here. One of the most beautiful monasteries in northern Armenia. And then the main monastery church is in the background of the picture. Here's the inside of the church today. Beautiful stone. You can see in the altar apse area that there were beautiful frescoes. These should be restored. Maybe they will be in the future. And this is very interesting. This is the scriptorium. So this is where he would have copied his texts. And do you notice the holes in the ground? Apparently, we've mentioned, I think it's come up in this lecture series or maybe another, that manuscripts were often stolen by raiders. And it became so common, it was almost like an income source for these nomadic raiders or brigands who lived in the area. When they wanted cash, they would make a run on a monastery and basically steal a bunch of the treasure or precious objects or manuscripts, and then they would hold them ransom and wait for some wealthy Armenian to come and purchase them back, and then they would, make off with whatever they got in exchange. And so in this scriptorium, they had carved out these hiding places in the floor so that when raiders would come, they would take the most precious manuscripts and hide them down there and probably cover it with stone or something like that, or maybe rugs, and hope that they wouldn't know about this or be able to steal at least the most beautiful manuscripts or most precious manuscripts. And it's possible there was a raid in 1795 and some of the monks were killed in it, and it's possible that that's how Sayat Nova died. There's some uncertainty about the manner, the nature and when he died, but he may have died in one of these raids. We have this is one of the colophons he wrote, one of the notes he wrote. So we have a Nareg manuscript handwritten by him, a copy of Nareg's Book of Prayers. And at the end of it, look at how nice this Armenian is. Not nice, but this is more standard classical Armenian as opposed to his dialect. So he knew that also. It says, Karatsavi Gilan Anzali Yegeretzin Tevin Ramim Je. So Hazar Irgu Haryur Dasa. Ov Anterzo Hishya Kudzol Estapanos Vartabed Vor Sayat Nova Asin. Yev Haid I Mahdisi Garabed. Yev Tuk Hisha Linik. Adat Shortutian Hach Bedo Zakaria Vartabed Tiflis. So this was written in Gilan in the Church of Anzal in the year 1210 of the Armenian era, so 1760. O reader, remember the scribe, me, Stepanos Vartabed, whom they call Sayat Nova, and my father, the pilgrim Gadabed, and you also shall be remembered. In the priorate or under the leadership of Haghpat Monastery of Zakaria of Tiflis Vartabed. And there's been some questions or discussion about him using the term Vartabed here, because Vartabeds, of course, were unmarried celibate priests, and we know was married and had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. And so he might have just been using this word in the sense of teacher or master, and not the ecclesiastical Vartabed position, because it doesn't seem like he was. And especially not probably in 1760 when we know he was married and had just left the court. So the manuscripts that we have from him are a Nareg and also different Bible manuscripts, portions of scripture, and maybe a few others. Okay, so this is some hopefully a richer presentation of Sayat Nova's life and context and the things he was involved in. I certainly learned a lot of new things really digging into the sources about his life, and it's a really fascinating period of Armenian history and cultural life. And there are other Ashughs, not just Sayat Nova. So Nagash Hob Natan is one of the well-known ones. He was a generation before Sayat Nova. He was from Tiflis and composed in similar kind of dialect to Sayat Nova. And there's others as well. Okay, so let's look at just a couple of his songs. And unlike many of the figures here, we actually have some very likely music and recordings and melodies of his music, because in the 19th century, some of the music was written down and by people who claim to have remembered the songs either as he sang it or as they had become popular and were sung. So it's either just like it was or very, very close. It's not like, the things from earlier generations where we have no clue as to how it was sung or performed. It's actually close. So let's look just a little bit at the Armenian. This is one of his well-known ones. And you'll hear his Georgian Armenian dialect. So Ashugh es achchim kashi kanivor jan is ins ama. An mahagan churov liken oske panchan is ins ama. Nestim veras shavakanis zarpap varan is ins ama. Suches imatsi enenses spane sultanu khan is ins ama. Mechket salbu chinaribes ranket paranki atlasai. Lizut shakar broshet gant agreket margrid almase. Osku mechen mina arads achkirit agnagab tase. Batbagan ankin chavahir lau Bagdash Khan is ins ama. So this is the first part of the song. I'll not cry alas to all this world, so long as you are the soul of my life. You are my golden goblet, brimming with immortal water. When I sit down, you are my shade. You are my gilded canopy. Discover in what I'm blameworthy, then put me to death. You are both my sultan and khan. Your waist is slim as a cypress, your color is French satin. Your tongue is sweet, your lips are pink candy, and your teeth are pearls. Your eyes shine as polished bowls, polished and worked in gold. Wondrous, priceless gem, you are the very ruby of Badesh Khan. And we'll come back to listen to this one in just a minute. I'll just read the English for the rest of it. This suffering, how am I to endure it? Do you think my heart is stone? You have made my tears bloody with pain. You have brought me to the edge. Yet you are a garden circled with roses. Would that I could perch near you like a nightingale. You are lovely to behold. Loving you has made me mad. I am awake, but my heart is dreaming. Though the world is content with the world, my heart still longs for you. So beautiful, this line. Ashchares ashcharov gashtatzav, im sirdes kiznit sovmanats. Dear one, in what other way can I praise you? There's nothing else in the world left for me to do. You are brilliant as a winged horse of fire. My gazelle leapt up from the sea. Since you are the one Sayat Nova loves, why not speak to him just once? Your radiance shadows all the world. You are splendid as the sun. You are cardamom, rose, carnation, violet, and susamber. You are my lily of the valley, a rose-tinted flower of the field. This is translated by Autumn Tolagyan. So let's listen to a kind of modern performance of it. Okay, hopefully you enjoyed that. There are many, many, many recordings of many songs of Sayat Nova, and you should go listen on YouTube or Spotify or wherever to different ones. This seems like one of the more traditional sort of ones where it's mostly the one musician and his instrument, essentially. One of the really interesting things to me about the way the singer sings is how, if you notice, like it proceeds very slowly and the vowels are very, very prolonged, which you can actually see a lot of crossover between the way the church sharagans are sung and these pieces, especially as the sharagans are sung in the Bolsahai, like this Istanbul Armenian or Turkish Armenian tradition, where much more like prolonged vowels, and especially in the slower sharagans. And it's clearly in Sayat Nova's music, it's a way of emphasizing the kind of emotional feeling that's deep, deep behind each one of these poems. And the way the strings and the voice interact really conveys that depth of feeling in a very, very powerful way. One of the very interesting things about his poems that I found was there's really a lot of variety in the translations, and I didn't have enough time to really dig really deep into his language, and I'm not so familiar with Persian, Turkish, or Georgian, which he borrows from and uses in his dialect. So there's a lot of words where there's debates over meaning and things like that. And one of the very typical examples is this famous song of his, Ashugh mi panjarae, which in various ways is translated or understood either as the world is a cage or the world is a window, and then even the world is a mosaic. So some translators do it as the world is a cage, connecting it with a Hindi, like Indian word panjara from northern Indian languages, which also circulated at that time. And then another interpretation is from, I think it's the Persian word panjara, which is the same word as the other, but means window. And that's the more, I think, slightly more common translation you'll see. And then there have also been many people there's been translations of his poems from his Georgian Armenian dialect to like standard Eastern Armenian or Western Armenian. And in one of the standard Eastern Armenian translations, it translates it as Ashugh Khijanagare. This world is a mosaic. So I'll read a couple of the stanzas here, and then we'll look at two very, very different English translations just to see kind of the variety of meaning. And it's actually interesting. His poems have not really been comprehensively translated into English, as popular as he is. He's not been translated as much. There's been select translations here and there, but not very detailed translation or commentaries written on his text. Ashugh me panjarae taghirumen bezarilim medig devogen guchutzvi taghirumen bezarilim erek laver gans vuresor taghirumen bezarilim mart hamasha megchili taghirum bezarilim. This is the verb like alal or limil in the Georgian Armenian dialect. Alim. Tovlaten etibar chune. Hipor gerta ir shakarov. Lav martin ene. Kuluchen bahe ashcharumes etibarov. Ashchares mizmenaluche. Imasna sirat chabarov. Guzim terchi bulbuli bes. Barirumen bezarilim. Ov gosete his guabrim arudemen inshru muden. Astuzu terumen hishte martu ashchart yelumuden. Ugurtes endur janpa chekunum shadati lechal chisuden. Ksanen me ru chinbahum arirumen bezarilim. Ashcharis mizmena luce, kani nestink zogu sapin, hum gantagir, atami zat, nalatali et kupatpin. Ham pirutinas hadile, chimtimanum chalchi kapin. Tostiris tushman indari, yagirumen bezarilim. Sayat novena sats, dardes ganzme jaren shadatzile. Chunim varvan kachzer parkas, himi taren shadatzile. Bulbulibes endurgulam, bartis charen shadatzile. Chinto num vachlim patvilu, karirumen bezarilim. And then you can see two fairly different translations, one by Adam Telegian and the other by Charles Dowsett. So first on the left, the world's a window, I'm weary of so many windows. He who looks in them is harmed. I'm tired of so many windows. Yesterday was better than today. I'm weary of tomorrows. Man isn't always the same. I'm weary of all the games that are played. The wealth that can vanish in battle is not to be trusted. The good man's the one whose conduct is good. The world will not be left to us, or so say the sages. I want to fly like the nightingale. I'm weary of the land. Who says that I must live from morning till dusk? Man's entry, man's exit, is simple work for the hand of God. Truth no longer walks a straightforward path, and people lie at an ever-quickening pace. Not 1 in 20 keeps a secret. I'm weary of the whole lot of masters. However much we feast, how much enjoy, the world will not finally be left to us. Childish, milk-fed sons of Adam, I curse you for your feasting. My patience is gone, I can't stand to see merriment anymore. My friends have become my enemies, I'm weary of all the games that are played. Sayat Nova said, my troubles have outgrown their remedies. I can't have tomorrow's sweet glory. The whole world seeks it today. And so I cry like a nightingale. There are more and more pests on my roses, and they won't let my roses bloom. I'm weary of searching for a splendid one to pick. And with this poem, we see one of the other prominent themes of his poetry. So in addition to the love poems, there's also a lot about essentially like world weariness or world sickness, being despondent about the world or frustrated by things. And if you think about them as being performed in the context of feasting and drinking and etc., those are kind of the two main emotions. So like pleasure, love, that great feeling you get drinking and enjoying, and then kind of the like hungover, full of everything, there's too much, and like everything seems terrible, later. So here's the other translation. The world is a cage, the vaulted bays make me sick. Touch the bars, they burn. The wheels they raise make me sick. Tomorrow will be worse. Unending days make me sick. A man can't be himself. Vapid ways make me sick. Blind fate has no favorites as she hunts around. If you want to survive, keep your feet on the ground. If this world is to vanish, as philosophers propound, this nightingale goes with it. The maze makes me sick. What man can be sure he'll live till tonight? Of course, if God's with you, you'll be all right. My truths are all countered by slander and spite. A minstrel can't make a living. Noble ways make me sick. Cavort as we may, this world will go. A curse on fidelity. No one wants to know. My patience is exhausted. Who is not my foe? My friends all hate me. Public gaze makes me sick. My troubles flood in like the ocean deep. The rose grows new thorns. I, the nightingale, weep. No fresh fame will greet me when I rise from my sleep. You're rejected, Sayat Nova. Blame and praise make me sick. You can see a lot of variety in the translation, similar definitely in the overall feeling and the overall message, but in terms of the choice of words and and some of the interpretation of some of the words is a little bit different. So this is just a taste. Obviously, the best way to experience Sayat Nova's poetry is by listening to the songs. And if you can have the words with you and listen, it's a really wonderful experience. And I want to end this lecture and this whole series just by playing the first 5 minutes of this movie, The Color of Pomegranates, which I talked about. I can't think of a better way to end this series. And I'd just like to say again how enjoyable it was for me. And I hope that this has been an interesting and novel approach to Sayat Nova, and will encourage people to dig deeper into his music, and through a taste of this film, get to see and appreciate him in another richer way. Well, we'll end the series there. Thank you again, everyone, so much for your attention, and hope to see you all in a future series.